Every mechanic in 3 states had given up on the dead motorcycle, and the man who had ridden in to claim it had hands large enough to end a life. The garage had gone quiet as a grave. The only sound was the slow tick of cooling exhaust pipes out in the lot, and the dry rattle of a swamp cooler that had not worked right since the Carter administration. Then from the shadows near the broom closet, an old woman set down her dustpan, and in a voice worn smooth as river stone, she said the 6 words that froze 60 years of hard living where it stood. "You buried him with the wrong key." Nobody moved. For a long moment, nobody even breathed. The town was called Dry Fork, a scatter of cinder block buildings and rusted water tanks, an hour northeast of Reno, where the Nevada desert went flat and pale, and the heat came off the asphalt in waves you could see, but could not touch. It was the kind of town men passed through on their way to somewhere with a name people recognized. The kind of place that had been dying so slowly for so long that the dying had become a way of life, like a cough you stopped noticing. It was a Thursday in late June, a few minutes past 2 in the afternoon, and the heat had teeth. The thermometer nailed to the post outside Decker's Cycle Works read 106 degrees, and it was lying low. Inside the open bay doors, the air smelled of gasoline and hot metal, and the particular sweat of men who were frightened and did not want to show it. The reason for the fear had rolled in 20 minutes earlier on the back of a heavy flatbed truck, escorted by 11 motorcycles whose engines you could feel in your back teeth a full mile before you saw them. They came down the highway in a loose wedge chrome, throwing the sun back like blades, and when they turned into the gravel lot of the cycle shop, the dust they raised hung in the air a long time, after the way smoke hangs over a place where something has burned. They were the Desert Saints. Not a name you said loud in that part of Nevada, unless you meant it. They had been riding the high desert for the better part of 50 years, and they had buried more of their own than most towns had living souls. They did not announce themselves. They did not have to. At the front of them, the first man off his bike was Duke Steele. He was a mountain of a man, somewhere on the backside of 50, with a gray beard that reached the second button of his cut and forearms like knotted hawser rope. His face had been built by weather and grief and a few thousand miles of road wind, and it did not give anything away. His leather vest was sun-faded to the color of an old saddle, and across the back under the rocker that said Nevada was the patch the whole of Dry Fork had been taught to look away from. Duke had been the enforcer of the Desert Saints for more than 30 years, and for the last 3 months since they had put Silas Boone in the ground, he had been their acting president, a job he had never wanted and could not give back. He walked into the garage like a man walking into a church, slow with his hat in his hand, except he was not carrying a hat. He was carrying the weight of a promise he did not know how to keep. Behind him, strapped down under blue moving blankets, on the bed of the flatbed, was the reason for all of it. It was a 1985 Harley-Davidson FXR. To anyone who did not know, it was just an old motorcycle, low and lean, its black paint gone dull, the chrome on its pipes pitted with the kind of rust the desert puts on everything it loves. But to the men who wore the death's head, that machine was holy ground on 2 wheels. It had a name. They called it the Revelator, because the man who built it used to say it could make a sinner confess just by starting up next to him at a red light. The man who built it was Silas Preacher Boone, and he had founded the Desert Saints in a borrowed garage in 1971. And he had ridden the Revelator at the front of every memorial run for 38 years. And 3 months ago, his heart had quit on him in his sleep, quiet as a man turning over to face the wall. He was 81 years old. He had not been sick a day in his life. He had simply, one Tuesday morning, not woken up. And now the club was preparing the largest memorial run anyone in the high desert had ever seen. Riders were coming in from 4 states. They would gather Saturday at dawn, and they would ride the old coast highway clear down to the chapel above the water, where Preacher had asked in his will to have his ashes scattered into the wind. Tradition older than any man now living said one thing about a memorial run, and it said it without exception. The dead man's bike leads the pack. There was only one problem. The revelator was dead too. Clint Decker stood by his largest toolbox, wiping his hands on a red shop rag for the fourth time in 5 minutes, though they had not been dirty since the bikes pulled in. Clint was a good mechanic. He had built and tuned engines for 40 years, had a wall of trophies from custom shows in Vegas and Sturgis, had hands that could feel a 1/4,000th of play in a bearing. He was also, at that particular moment, a man trying very hard not to be sick. "Tell me she's breathing," Clint Duke said, and his voice was a low rumble that barely carried the way thunder carries when the storm is still over the next county. Clint swallowed. He looked at the blanketed shape on the truck, then back at the man who had asked, and he made the only choice an honest man can make, which is to tell the truth and pray it is enough. "Duke, I'm going to give it to you straight because I respect this club and I respected Preacher." He took a breath. "I've had my 3 best men on that motorcycle for 2 weeks. We rebuilt the carburetor from the float up. We replaced the entire wiring harness. New stator, new rotor, new coil, new plugs, new battery. We tore down the top end and checked the compression on both cylinders. It's perfect. By every book and every gauge I own, that engine should fire on the first kick." "I didn't come for a lesson," Duke said. "I came to hear Preacher's bike turn over." "It won't." Clint's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. "Every time we hit the starter, it cranks clean, and it won't catch. There's no spark at the right moment, and if you try to kick it, it kicks back so hard it nearly broke Sawyer's leg. We've got the X-ray to prove it, and the battery." He spread his hands, helpless. "Brand new battery, fully charged, and inside of 10 minutes something pulls it stone dead. There's a drain somewhere down deep in that frame that I cannot find. And God knows I've looked. I'm sorry, Duke, I am. But that bike doesn't need a mechanic. It needs a priest." Behind Duke, the 11 riders who had filed in stood with their arms crossed and their faces still, and the temperature in that garage, which was already 106, seemed to climb another 10 degrees. Duke did not raise his voice. That was the thing about him that frightened men most. He walked past Clint without looking at him, walked to the flatbed, and reached up and drew the moving blanket back off the motorcycle, slow and gentle, the way you draw a sheet back from the face of someone you love, to look at them one last time. There she was, the revelator, black and low and mean, the leather seat worn to the shape of one particular man who would never sit in it again. Duke rested his enormous, scarred hand on that seat, and for a moment the iron in him went somewhere else, somewhere 30 years back, and the whole garage looked away to give him the privacy. "He pulled me out of a ditch in El Paso in 1989, Duke said, and though he spoke to no one, every man heard it. I was 22, and I was going to drink myself to death or get killed trying. And this man got off his bike in the rain, and he picked me up out of the mud, and he said, 'Son, you are not finished yet. You only think you are.' And he gave me a reason to be alive." Duke's jaw worked. "This bike leads him home on Saturday. If it doesn't, then everything he built dies the day we put him in the dirt, and I will not allow that. I will not." He turned, and the sorrow in his eyes had gone hard and cold, the way water goes to ice. "I'll give you till tomorrow noon," Clint, Duke said quietly. "If I come back and that engine is still dead, I'm taking my bike, and I'm taking the $5,000 I paid you up front, and I am taking it one way or the other." Clint Decker knew exactly what one way or the other meant. He had a wife of 31 years and a mortgage and a daughter at the university in Reno, and he had a garage he had bled for. And he looked at the dead motorcycle and felt the bottom drop out of his whole life. That was the moment the old woman picked up to speak. "You buried him with the wrong key." The words cut through the heat and the fear like a blade through cheesecloth. Duke Steele turned his head. Clint blinked. The 11 riders turned all at once, and a few hands dropped on instinct toward belts and boots. She was standing in the dim corner by the broom closet, where she had been the whole time, so still and so unremarkable that not one of them had registered she was there. She was a small woman, narrow as a fence rail, somewhere in her middle 70s, with white hair pulled back hard from a face that the sun had folded into 100 lines. She wore a man's chambray work shirt, buttoned to the wrist, despite the heat, and over it a pair of canvas coveralls so old the blue had gone to the color of dust. Her hands holding the broom were a working person's hands, the knuckles swollen, the nails clipped square. A faded smear of grease worked so deep into the creases of her fingers that 40 years of washing had never gotten it out. This was Della Vaughn. She swept the floors at Decker Cycle Works. She lived in the cinder block storeroom out back on a cot with a hot plate and a granddaughter and one window that looked out at the mountains. Clint paid her almost nothing because almost nothing was almost more than the shop could spare. And he let her stay because his own daddy had told him once, a long time ago, that a man is measured by how he treats the people the world has decided not to see. Clint had never once heard her speak about an engine. "Della," Clint said low and fast, the panic rising in him fresh. "Della, this is club business. Go on back now. Go check on Maisie." She did not move. She did not look at Clint. She looked at Duke Steele, and she did not look up at him the way small people look up at large, dangerous men. She looked at him the way a woman looks at the weather level and unafraid. "I knew that machine before you knew that machine," she said. "And I'm telling you it isn't broken. It's locked. There's a difference, and the difference is the only thing that's going to get him to that chapel on Saturday." A younger rider near the back let out a short bark of a laugh. He was a prospect named Cody, all elbows and attitude, his cut still missing the bottom rocker that would make him a full member. And he had something to prove, and no sense yet about when to prove it. "You hear that, boys? The cleaning lady's gonna fix it." He grinned around at the others. "Step aside, Granny. This is grown folks' work." Duke Steele lifted one hand, just lifted it, palm down, and Cody's mouth shut so fast you could hear his teeth click. The big man had not taken his eyes off the old woman the whole time. "Say that again," Duke told her. "The part about the key." Della Vaughn leaned her broom against the wall, careful like it was a tool she respected, and she walked out into the light of the open bay where the dead motorcycle sat on the truck. She had a slight limp, the left hip, the kind a person earns over decades and learns to ride out. The riders parted for her without quite deciding to. She stopped at the flatbed and laid her swollen hand flat on the cam cover of the engine, the brushed aluminum side of it, and she closed her eyes for just a second the way a doctor lays a hand on a fevered child. "This is not a stock motor," she said. "It looks like a 1985 Evolution because the man who built it wanted it to look like one. But it's a liar. Underneath that cover, it's a hybrid, an Evo bottom end mated to a shovel head cam and a cam gear off a wrecked panhead, machined to fit by hand because the man who built it was too stubborn and too broke to do it the easy way. He advanced the ignition timing 12 degrees past the factory mark because that's where this particular Frankenstein wants to live. Time it by the book, by the marks stamped at the factory, and the spark hits the cylinder while the intake valve is still hanging open. The whole charge detonates against an open door. She opened her eyes. "That's your no-start. That's your kickback that near took the young fella's leg off. You boys aren't fighting a dead engine. You're fighting an engine that's exactly as alive as it was the day it was built, doing exactly what it was built to do, and you're reading it the wrong instructions." Clint Decker had gone very still by his toolbox. He was a master mechanic, and he had just heard a 74-year-old woman describe from across a room, without a wrench in her hand, the precise symptoms his three best men had spent 2 weeks failing to diagnose. "The battery," Clint heard himself say. "What about the battery drain?" Della almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost." "That's not a short," she said. "That's a kill switch." He was a paranoid old goat about somebody stealing this bike, so he ran a second ignition bypass straight up the backbone of the frame and grounded it through a hidden toggle tucked up under the lip of the left side of the tank, where your thumb finds it, but your eye never does. Leave that toggle open and the starter will crank all day long, but the coil is grounded straight to the frame. No spark gets through. And the whole circuit bleeds your fresh battery dead inside of 10 minutes. She wiped her hand slowly down the leg of her coveralls. You have to throw the hidden switch before you turn the key. Always did. Every single time. There's a trick to this bike, and the man who knew the trick is the man you just put in the ground, and he took it with him. And that, mister, is what I mean by the wrong key. The garage was so quiet you could hear the swamp cooler die and stutter and try to live again. Cody the prospect was not grinning anymore. Duke Steele looked at the old woman for a long, long time. Something was moving behind his weathered face, slow like a great fish turning in deep water. He had heard a story once a long time ago when he was new to the club and Preacher was still a vital man in his 50s. A story about a wrench. Not a mechanic, the old members had said, leaning close over their beers with a kind of reverence they used for nothing else. A wrench. A ghost who could read iron like scripture, who built half the engines that had carried the club through its hardest years, who signed the work with a little stamped mark, and was never, ever seen. The club had a name for that ghost, said low and proud, the way you'd say the name of a saint. But Duke could not for the life of him remember the name. It had been 30 years. How do you know all this? He said. It was not quite a question. It was closer to a man easing his foot down on ice, testing whether it would hold. Delavon looked at him, and for just one heartbeat, something old and tired and full of a private grief crossed her face. And then it was gone, folded away into the 100 lines of her, and what was left was only the level, weatherproof calm. I read a lot, she said, and I've been around motorcycles my whole life. You want it fixed by Saturday, or you want to stand here and wonder how a cleaning woman talks? Clint stepped forward, fast, hands up, peacemaking. Duke, I have to say it. She's an old woman. I don't doubt she knows a thing or two. Lots of folks her age grew up around bikes, but you cannot put the memory of this club on a hunch from somebody who sweeps my floor. If she's wrong about that timing, if we advance it 12 degrees and she's guessing, we'll bend the new push rods on the first kick, and you'll have nothing at all to bury him with. I can't in good conscience. Then put your conscience away, Duke said, because right now she's the only person in this building who has told me one single thing I didn't already know. He turned back to Della. What do you need? He said. She looked at the bike. She looked at it the way a person looks at an old wound that has finally been uncovered after years under a bandage. I need your men to do exactly what I tell them, she said. Every bolt, every wire, every degree when I say, and how I say. I can't torque a head down anymore. These hands gave out on me 20 years ago. But I can tell them where every fastener goes, and I can tell them in what order, and I can tell them what they'll find before they find it. That's the deal. I'm the foreman. They're the hands. She lifted her chin a fraction toward Clint, including him. Clint Decker's mouth opened and shut. Duke Steele looked at his shop owner, and then at his dead brother's bike, and then at the small, fierce woman standing in the heat, and for the first time in 3 months, something that was almost like hope moved in his chest. You heard the foreman, he said. That should have been the moment the work began. It was not because that was the moment a 4-door sedan, gray and clean, and out of place as a shark in a creek, pulled into the gravel lot and parked sideways across 2 of the bikes, and a man in a short-sleeved dress shirt and a tie got out holding a leather folder and walked toward the bay doors, squinting against the glare, calling out a name in a flat, official, carrying voice. I'm looking for a Mrs. Delavon. I have some paperwork that requires her signature today. It's regarding... And Delavon's whole body went rigid, and the color drained out of her folded face. And for the first time since she had set down her broom, the level calm cracked clean through, and underneath it Duke Steele saw something he understood right down to the bone, because he had felt it himself in El Paso, in the rain before a stranger picked him up out of the mud. He saw fear. The man with the folder was named Raymond Holden, and he was a portfolio manager for the holding company that had 3 weeks ago purchased the note on a 40-acre parcel of high desert scrub at the edge of Dry Fork. a parcel with one small adobe house on it and a long, low, windowless metal building that the county records described inaccurately as a storage barn. The note was $11,000 in arrears. Della Vaughn was 4 payments behind. The company that now held the paper did not want $11,000. They wanted the 40 acres because the 40 acres sat directly in the path of a planned solar field and a frontage road, and they were worth to the right buyer at the right moment a great deal more than $11,000. The fastest way to the land was through the old woman, and the fastest way through the old woman was a notice of default with a signature line and a deadline. And the deadline, Mr. Holden explained, consulting his folder with the patience of a man who had done this many times, was 9 o'clock Saturday morning. If she could not bring the account current by then, the property would proceed to sale. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, the same hour the memorial run was to roll out at the front of town. Della took the folder in hands that had begun very slightly to shake. "I'll have it," she said. Her voice was thin, now thinner than the broom handle calm of a minute before. "I'll have the money." Mr. Holden gave her the smile of a man who had heard those words 1,000 times and seen them come true exactly, never. "I certainly hope so, ma'am," he said, and he got back in his clean gray car and backed carefully off the 2 motorcycles he had nearly knocked over and drove away, and the dust of him hung in the still hot air a long time, the way the dust of the saints had hung an hour before. It was very quiet in the garage. Then a small voice came from the doorway of the storeroom out back, where a thin girl of about 9, with 2 crooked braids and her grandmother's same level dark eyes, had been standing unnoticed through the whole of it. "Grandma," Maisie said, "are they going to take our house?" Nobody answered the child because the truth was that nobody knew, and the men of the Desert Saints were not in the habit of lying to children. Della crossed the floor to her granddaughter and knelt down slow on her bad hip and took the girl's small face in her 2 grease-creased hands. "You let me worry about the house," she said. "That's grown-up worry. Your worry is whether you finished your reading for the summer packet, and I happen to know you haven't, so go on and do it, and don't you come out here bothering these men." She tucked a flyaway strand of hair back into the crooked braid. "Go on now. I'm fine." Maisie looked at her grandmother a moment longer with the unsettling steadiness of a child who has already learned that grown-ups say, "I'm fine," the way they say, "It's nothing." And then she nodded once gravely and went back into the storeroom and shut the door. And you could tell from the set of her thin shoulders that she did not believe a word of it. Duke Steele watched the whole thing without a sound. When Della stood up and turned back to the bike, he was looking at her differently, and she knew it, and she did not like it. "How much?" he said. "That's none of your concern." "It's exactly my concern," Duke said. "If you're going to be standing on your feet over my brother's engine for the next 36 hours, with a sale on your home set for the same hour I'm trying to roll out of town. A foreman with her mind half on a county courthouse is no foreman to me. How much are you behind?" Della's jaw set. The pride in her was an old pride ground hard and smooth by years of leaning on no one, and it did not bend easy. $11,000, she said at last, and the number cost her something to say out loud. "And don't you dare reach for a wallet, Mr. Steele. I'll not take charity from a man I met an hour ago. Not for the house, not for anything. I'll earn what's mine, the way I've earned everything I've ever had. You want this motorcycle to run by Saturday? Then that's a job, and a job pays a wage, and I'll take the wage and not $1 more. And I'll get my own self current with my own money, and that's the end of it." Duke Steele looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly something moved at the corner of his hard mouth that on another man you might have called the beginning of a smile. "All right," he said. "Then you're hired, and the wage for getting preacher to that chapel is going to be a fair one. We'll settle the number when she runs. Until then," he looked around the garage at Clint, at the 3 exhausted mechanics standing in the back, at the 11 leather-clad men crowding the bay. "Until then, every man in this room works for her. That clear?" It was clear. The work began that evening in the long copper light that comes to the high desert, when the sun finally lets go of its grip on the day, and it began the way Della had said it would, with grown men following the whispered orders of a woman who could no longer lift a wrench. She set herself a stool, an old steel mechanic stool with a cracked vinyl seat, and she perched on it beside the bike like a small bird on a fence post. And she ran that garage with a quiet, total authority that none of them had ever experienced. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She knew where every bolt lived. She knew the order of operations the way a preacher knows the order of a service, by heart from the inside out. "Earl," she said to the biggest of Clint's mechanics, a slab-shouldered man with a Marine Corps eagle tattooed on one forearm. "Pull the cam cover right side and put a drain pan under her first, unless you favor an oil bath. And when you get it off, don't you go reaching in there with your fat fingers. You call me over, and I'll tell you what you're looking at." Earl, who had not taken an order from anyone but Clint in 12 years, found himself reaching for the drain pan before he had decided to. When the cam cover came off and the guts of the engine lay open under the harsh drop light, all of them gathered close, and Della had Earl lift her by the elbow up onto a milk crate so she could see down into it. And she produced from the breast pocket of her chambray shirt a small flashlight, worn silver at the edges from a lifetime of being gripped. And she shone it down onto the gears, and she went still. She was quiet for a long time. "There," she said finally, and her voice had changed. It had gone soft, the way a voice goes when it touches something the heart was not braced for. "The pinion gear. Look at the timing mark." Clint Decker leaned in beside her, squinting, and after a moment, his breath went out of him in a long, slow hiss. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "That's not an Evo mark. There's a V stamped next to it. That's hand cut." He looked up at her, and there was a new thing in his face now, something between awe and dread. "That's a shovel head gear cut down to fit, just like you said. Della, how in God's name did you—" "Advance it 12 degrees off the factory mark," she said, talking over him, not letting the question land. "Not 11, not 13, 12. And before you so much as touch a wrench to it, every one of you take a good long look at those push rods. Because I'll lay you money they're already bent. And there's the back half of your trouble." The wiry mechanic named Sawyer, the one whose shin the bike had nearly broken, scrambled to the bench where the engine's internal rods had been laid out on a clean towel 2 weeks before and never reinstalled. He picked one up and rolled it across the flat steel of the bench top the way you check a rod for true, and it wobbled, an ugly, visible wobble. And he picked up the next, and it wobbled too. "They're bent," Sawyer said, and his voice climbed. "All 4 of them. The kickback bent them. Clint, we never even checked. We figured the no-start was electrical. We never—" "And there it is," Della said, and there was no triumph in it, only a kind of weariness, as if she had been waiting 2 weeks at the bottom of her own quiet life for these men to catch up to a thing she had known from the doorway. "You can't run her on bent rods. The valves'll kiss the pistons, and you'll have a hand grenade instead of a motor." A cold understanding settled over the garage. "So we order new push rods," Earl said. "Overnight 'em from Reno. We'll have 'em by—" "You will not," Della said, "because they don't make these. Standard Evo rods are the wrong length for that shovel head cam geometry, and shovel rods are shorter still. The man who built this bike cut these 4 rods himself, by hand on a lathe, to a measurement that exists nowhere on this earth except in his own dead head, and in the 4 ruined pieces of steel you're holding." She let that sit a moment, watching it land. "You cannot buy these. You cannot order these. There is no catalog. No warehouse, no shop in this country that has them." Big Earl set the bent rod back down on the towel very gently, the way you set down something that has just become useless. And the silence that came after was a different silence than before. Before, the silence had been fear of Duke Steel. This silence was worse. This was the silence of men who have finally diagnosed a dying patient only to learn the cure does not exist. It was full dark now, outside the bay doors. They had until noon. "Then it's over," Sawyer said very quietly. "We did everything she said, and she's right about all of it, And it doesn't matter because we can't make the parts. We're done. Out in the lot, Duke Steele heard the words through the open doors, and the iron came back into his face. And he turned and looked at the small woman on the milk crate, and he did not say a thing, but the weight of his disappointment filled the whole garage like floodwater coming up under a door. Della Vaughn climbed down off the milk crate, slow easing her bad hip, and when her feet were on the concrete, she stood there a moment with her hand resting on the open engine, and she closed her eyes. She was remembering a man at a lathe in a metal building at the edge of the desert 30 years and more ago. A man with sawdust of steel in his beard and a grin like a boy holding up a freshly cut push rod to the light and saying, "You build a Frankenstein, darling. You best keep a few spare body parts in the cellar because the monster will throw a part someday, and there won't be a soul on earth can make him another but you and me." "There are spares," Della said. Every head in the garage turned. She opened her eyes. He made spares. He always made spares. A full set of these rods cut on the same lathe to the same number, plus the cam gear, plus a spare set of the custom valve springs. Because he knew this engine better than he knew his own children, and he knew exactly what it would break and when. She drew a slow breath, and when she spoke again, the words came out steady, but it cost her every bit of steadiness she had. "And I know exactly where they are. They've been sitting in a wooden crate on a shelf in a metal building 40 acres east of here for 30 years. Clint Decker stared at her. "Della," he said slowly, that's the storage barn on your property, the one in the foreclosure." "It's not a storage barn," Della Vaughn said. "It never was a storage barn." And out in the lot in the dark, leaning against the dead motorcycle of the only man who had ever known her secret, Duke Steele heard the name come back to him. After 30 years, the name the old members used to say, low and proud over their beers. The name of the ghost who built the engines that had carried the desert saints through their hardest years and was never once seen. They had called the ghost the Dove. They went out to the property in a convoy under a sky so thick with stars, it looked like spilled salt, the flatbed leading, with the revelator still chained to its bed, Duke and 4 of his riders behind, and Della Vaughn in the cab of Clint's truck, giving directions to roads that had no signs. The 40 acres lay at the end of a washboard dirt track that the desert was slowly taking back. There was the small adobe house, dark and square against the night, and 100 yards beyond it the long, low, metal building the county called a storage barn. Della had Clint pull right up to the wide rolling door of it, and she got down out of the cab herself, refusing Earl's offered hand. And she stood for a moment in the wash of the headlights, looking at that door as if it were a person she had not spoken to in a very long time. "I haven't been in here in 11 years, she said to no one in particular. "Not since my Tommy died, and I had nobody left to build for, and no heart left to build with." She took a key from a chain around her neck, an old brass key worn bright with handling, and she fitted into the padlock and her hands shook, and Clint stepped up quiet and steadied them with his own, not taking over, just steadying the way you steady an old friend. And together they turned the key, and the lock fell open, and Della rolled the heavy door back on its track. The headlights poured in. For a moment, nobody said anything at all, because there are sights a man does not have words ready for. It was a machine shop. Not a storage barn, not a hobbyist garage, but a full custom motorcycle machine shop. The kind a man might drive across 3 states to use, laid out with the careful, total order of someone who loved the work more than they loved being seen doing it. There was a lathe and a milling machine and a drill press, all of them old, all of them oiled, all of them draped in canvas the color of dust. There was a welding bench. There was an engine stand. There were pegboards along every wall, hung with hundreds of tools, every one of them in its painted outline, every one of them in its place, untouched for 11 years and dustless, because the building was sealed and the desert is dry as a bone. And on the far wall above the welding bench was a long shelf of wooden crates, each one stenciled in faded black paint with a name. The Revelator, the Wraith, Old Glory, the Preacher's Daughter. Names. The names of motorcycles. the names of the engines this woman had built, and stamped into the wood of every single crate, small and neat, was the mark. A bird in flight, wings spread. A dove. Duke Steele walked into that building slow with his hat that was not a hat in his hands, and he turned in a full circle, taking it in, and when he came back around to face the old woman, his face had broken open, all the iron of it gone soft, with a kind of grief and wonder he could not hold back. "You're the dove," he said. It was barely a whisper. "All those years, all those engines, the old men used to talk about you like you were a saint they'd never seen, like you were a story preacher made up to keep us honest. The dove built that. The dove tuned that. Nobody ever met you. Nobody knew if you were even real." His voice cracked clean down the middle. "You were real. You were here. You were 40 acres outside of town sweeping a floor, and we drove past you for 30 years. Delavon looked at him, and the level calm she had carried all day finally gave way, all the way. And what was underneath it was not weakness. It was something fiercer than weakness. It was the long, banked, patient anger of a person who has spent a lifetime being unseen and made her peace with it, and was now being seen all at once in the headlights by men who should have known her name. "Of course I was real," she said. "I was just never allowed to be." And in the long quiet that followed, with the desert wind moving cold and clean through the open door of the shop she had been exiled from for 11 years, Della Vaughn told them. She told them about a boy named Wade Vaughn, who in 1969 had ridden into Dry Fork on a stolen Triumph with a busted primary and 40 cents in his pocket, and who had walked into the only garage in town and met the owner's daughter, a girl of 17 with grease under her nails and a gift in her hands that the world had no use for in a girl. Her daddy had taught her engines because he had no sons, and then he had told her gently, the way you tell a child a hard, true thing, that no man would ever pay a woman to fix his motorcycle, so she had best find herself a husband who would. She found Wade Vaughn. He was the first man who ever watched her work and did not laugh. She told them that Wade was a founding member of the Desert Saints, one of the 7 men who started the club with Silas Boone in a borrowed garage in 1971, and that Wade had been Preacher's right hand and his closest brother, and that when the club needed iron, it was Della who built the iron in the back, out of sight, under her husband's name. Because in 1971, a motorcycle club was no place for a woman with a wrench, and the men would sooner have ridden a horse than admit their engines were tuned by a girl. She told them that in 1978, on a wet pass in the Sierra, Wade Vaughn had laid his bike down to keep from hitting a stalled car full of strangers, and that he had not gotten up, and that he was 29 years old, and that she was 26, and that she had buried him in the only black dress she owned, with the whole of the Desert Saints standing in the rain with their heads bare. And she told them that on the night of the funeral, Silas Boone had come out to the 40 acres and sat with her on the steps of the adobe house until dawn, and that he had made her 2 promises. The first was that she would never want for work, that the club would always bring its iron to her in the dark, off the books, for as long as she had hands to build with. And the second was that he would protect her, that no man would ever know whose hands had touched his engine, because Preacher knew what the world did to a widow alone on 40 acres with a gift, and he knew that her safety lived in her secret. So he gave her a name that was not her name. He called her the Dove, because Wade used to call her his dove, and he stamped that mark on every crate that left the shop. And for 31 years, the legend of the Dove grew across 4 states, while the woman herself grew old and gray and unseen behind it, exactly as he had promised, exactly as she had agreed. He kept his word, Della said, both words. To the day he died, he kept them. Nobody ever knew. The work got famous and I got invisible, and that was the bargain, and I made it with my eyes open, because the alternative was a woman alone in the desert with a reputation, and I'd seen what happened to women alone in the desert with a reputation. She looked at the long shelf of crated names that were her whole life's work. I don't blame him. I want you to understand that. He saved my life with that secret. But there is a cost to being kept safe by never being real, and I have paid it every single day for 50 years. And I am 74 years old and I am tired of it. And I would like, before I die, for somebody to know that the dove was a woman named Della, and that she was good. She was very, very good. For a long moment, not one of those hard men could speak. Then Duke Steele crossed the floor of that shop, and the big man got down on one knee in front of the small, old woman, the way you kneel before something holy. And he took her swollen, grease-creased hand in both of his enormous, scarred ones, and he bowed his gray head over it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick, "I have been a desert saint for 36 years, and I have ridden behind the work of your hands my whole life, and never once said thank you, because I never knew there was anyone to thank. So I'm saying it now. Thank you. For all of it. For every engine. For every brother you carried home safe on iron you built in the dark with no credit and no name." He lifted his head and looked her in the eye. "And I swear to you on Preacher's grave and on my own, that as long as there is one desert saint left breathing, you will never be invisible again, and you will never be alone, and you will never want for a single thing on this earth. That's not charity, that's a debt. 50 years overdue, and the interest on it would shame a loan shark, and we are going to pay it." Della Vaughn looked down at the kneeling giant, and at long, long last, the old banked anger went out of her, and her eyes filled, and one tear cut a clean track down through the desert dust on her cheek. "Then get up off my floor," she said softly, "and let's go bring Wade's best friend home. Top crate on the left, the one that says Revelator. Mind the lid the hinge sticks." The crate that said Revelator was where she said it would be, and inside it, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff with age, were 4 custom push rods cut on the lathe, 10 feet away, true and straight and perfect, and a spare cam gear with a small V stamped beside the timing mark, and a set of valve springs, and a single folded sheet of yellowed paper in Della's own younger hand, listing every measurement of the Revelator's secret heart numbers that existed nowhere else on Earth. Big Earl carried that crate out to the truck like a man carrying communion. They were loading it when the headlights came up the washboard road. It was a single motorcycle running hard, and the man on it came into the yard fast and laid it down sideways in a spray of gravel and was off it and walking before the dust settled, and the 4 saints who had come along stiffened all at once because they knew the rider. His name was Brock Riggs. He was a big man too, though not so big as Duke, somewhere in his 40s with a shaved head and a jaw like a snowplow, and the restless, hungry look of a man who has spent his whole life one rung lower than he believes he deserves. He had been a desert saint for 15 years, and he had wanted Preacher's chair for at least 10. And when the old man died in his sleep 3 months back, Brock Riggs had assumed the gavel would come to him because he was younger than Duke and louder than Duke, and he had a head for money where Duke had only a head for loyalty. The club had voted Duke acting president instead on the strength of nothing but love, and Brock Riggs had never forgiven any of them for it. "Heard there was a powwow out in the middle of nowhere," Riggs said, his eyes going around the yard, taking in the truck, the crate, the open shop, the old woman. "Heard the great Duke Steele's putting the memory of this whole club in the hands of the cleaning lady. Wanted to see it with my own eyes." He looked at Della, and something cold and pleased moved over his face. "Evening, Mrs. Vaughn. Funny running into you out here. Real funny. Small world." Della Vaughn looked at him for a long moment, and her face went carefully blank. And Duke Steele, who had learned that day to read every flicker of her, caught it. "You know this man," Duke said. "I know what he is," Della said quietly. "I knew it the second he opened his mouth." Brock Riggs laughed. "Oh, now don't be like that, Della. We're practically business partners." He turned to Duke, and the cold pleasure in him spread out into the open, because he had wanted to say this thing for weeks, and now he had an audience. "You want to know who holds the note on this dirt, Duke? You want to know who's going to own these 40 acres come Saturday morning? It's a holding company, And the holding company's got an investor, a quiet one, a local boy made good, who knows the solar people are coming through here with a frontage road and government money, and who knew it before anybody, and who's been buying up the dirt in this old lady's path for 2 years through paper, so a body can't trace it back to him. He spread his arms wide, grinning. You're looking at him, brother. By Saturday, I'm going to be richer than this whole sorry club put together. And the first thing I'm going to do with all that solar money is buy enough votes to take that gavel away from a sentimental old fool who'd rather chase a dead man's ghost than make us a single dime. The yard had gone very still. Duke Steele took one slow step toward him. You're behind the foreclosure, he said. You, a brother. You're the one trying to put a 74-year-old widow and a little girl out of their home. It's business, Riggs said, and the grin slipped just a little because he had not expected the temperature in Duke's voice. It's not personal. The dirt's worth a fortune and she can't pay her note. That's not my fault. That's arithmetic. 11 grand by 9 a.m. Saturday or it goes to sale, and I'm the only bidder that matters. And I've got the paperwork sewed up tight as a drum. There's nothing you can do about it, Duke. Not unless you got $11,000 laying around that I don't know about, which I happen to know for a fact you do not, because I've seen the club's books, and this chapter is broke as a Sunday church. He looked at the crated parts on the truck bed, and a new thought moved behind his eyes, and the grin came back uglier than before. Course, there's an easier way for everybody. That old FXR's a famous machine. Collectors would pay 6 figures for Preacher Boone's personal bike, restored or not. You let me sell the Revelator instead of running it into the ground on Saturday. I'll cover the old lady's note out of my own pocket as a kindness, and everybody walks away happy. That bike, Duke said very quietly, leads him home on Saturday. It is not for sale. It was never for sale. And you knew that when you said it, which is the only reason you said it to watch my face. Then I guess the old lady loses her house, Brock Riggs said, and shrugged, and the shrug was the cruelest thing any of them had seen all day. Sentiment's expensive, brother. You'll learn that when it's your house. He looked one more time around the yard at the shop, at the crate at Della, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he picked his bike up out of the gravel and threw a leg over it and fired it up. And over the roar of it, he leaned and called out one last thing. And the words landed in the cold desert dark like a curse. Tell you what, Della, you ever do get that motor to fire, you let me know. I'd love to hear the famous Dove run just once before I bulldoze her cellar. And then he was gone down the washboard road, his taillights shrinking into the dark, and the dust of him hung in the air the way the dust of bad men always hung in the air over that 40 acres. Refusing to settle. It was Earl who broke the silence. He said the Dove, Earl said slowly. How's he know about the Dove? Half the clubs never even heard that name. How's a money-grubbing snake like Brock Riggs know that name? Della Vaughn answered without turning around. She was looking down the road where the taillight had gone. Because his daddy was a desert saint, she said. Old Cyrus Riggs. Mean as a cottonmouth, drank himself stupid, beat that boy black and blue from the time he could walk. I built 3 engines for Cyrus Riggs over the years, and one drunk night around 1990, he put it together who I was, what I did, and he held on to it the way a small man holds on to anything that makes him feel big. Far as I know, the only thing Cyrus Riggs ever gave his son was that secret on his deathbed, like an inheritance. She finally turned, and in the spill of the headlights, her face was grim and old and absolutely unafraid. Brock Riggs has known I'm the Dove for years. It's how he found me. It's why he picked my 40 acres out of all the dirt in this county. He didn't just want the land. He wanted to be the man who finally cashed in the ghost. He wanted to own me the way his daddy never could. Clint Decker said very quietly what they were all thinking. Della, it's nearly midnight. The sale's at 9 Saturday morning. Even if we get the Revelator running by noon tomorrow, that's a victory for the club, but it's nothing for you. You'll have a famous engine purring like a kitten, and you'll still lose your house and your shop and that little girl's whole world to that animal by sunrise Saturday. Running the bike doesn't save you. It never did. And that was the cold arithmetic of it laid bare under the desert stars. And not one of them, not even Duke, had an answer to it. But Della Vaughn looked at the crate of perfect custom parts that her own younger hands had cut and hidden away 30 years before, against the day the monster threw apart, and something settled over her face that the men did not understand yet, a kind of grim, patient certainty. The look of a woman who has just realized that the answer to a problem has been sitting in her own cellar the whole time, waiting. "Load the crate," she said, "and somebody go wake that little girl gentle and bring her along because she's not staying out here alone on this property one more night, not with that man's eyes on it. We're going back to the shop, all of us, and we're going to bring the Revelator back to life by noon tomorrow." Her jaw set. "And then I'm going to show you boys exactly what 50 years of being invisible taught me about men like Brock Riggs. Because a person nobody sees, Mr. Steele, gets to watch everything. And I have been watching that family for a very long time. They worked through the night. Maisie slept on a folded moving blanket in the corner office of Decker Cycle Works under Big Earl's leather cut, which he had taken off and laid over her without a word, and which covered her like a tent. And the men of the Desert Saints took turns checking on her, the way men who have lost people check on the ones still small enough to save, looking in through the cracked door every little while, just to be sure she was breathing easy. And out in the bay under the drop lights, the bizarre and beautiful ballet went on. The old woman on the cracked stool, the slab-shouldered Marine, the wiry carburetor man, the gray electrician named Wendell, who had not said 10 words in his life, and the master mechanic Clint Decker, all of them bent to the will of a 74-year-old foreman who could no longer hold a wrench. She put the custom push rods in their hands and told them to the thousandth of an inch how far to set the valve lash. She had Wendell trace the phantom drain up the backbone of the frame until his fingers found the hidden bypass wire exactly where she said it would be spliced in, so clean you could run your thumb right over it and never know. And the tiny toggle switch recessed up under the lip of the left tank, just like she had told them 8 hours before in front of a room full of frightened men. When Wendell found it, he sat back on his heels and looked at the old woman with something close to fear. "It's right where you said," he said, "down to the inch. Down to the inch after 30 years. I put it there," Della said simply, and tightened the spring on the cam she had not touched in 3 decades, and did not look up. A person remembers where she hides things. Around 3 in the morning, with the cam timing locked at exactly 12 degrees of advance and the valve train singing true, Della had them stop and she sent Sawyer for coffee. And while the others stretched their backs and rolled their shoulders, she sat alone with her hand resting on the bike. And Duke Steele came and stood beside her in the dark at the edge of the lights. And for a while, neither of them said anything. "He never talked about you," Duke said at last. "In all those years, not once. I rode next to that man for 36 years, and he never said your name." "He promised me he wouldn't," Della said. "That was the whole of it. That was how he kept me safe. The day he stopped saying my name was the day I stopped existing, and that was the deal, and he honored it so completely that he carried it to his grave." She was quiet a moment. "It's a lonely thing, Mr. Steele, to be loved by being erased. I don't expect you to understand it, but he did love me, in his way. He came out every Christmas Eve, every single one for 31 years, and he sat on my steps and drank 1 cup of coffee and told me about every brother who'd come home safe on iron I'd built, and then he drove away and never came again until the next Christmas. That was my whole reward, 1 cup of coffee a year and the names of living men." She turned her face up to the big man in the dark. "It was enough. I made it be enough. You can make almost anything be enough if the alternative is nothing." Duke Steele did not trust himself to speak. "He left me something," Della said more to herself than to him. "He told me once, years ago, right here in this town drunk for the only time I ever saw him drunk, the night we buried old Cyrus Riggs, of all people. He said, 'Della, I've fixed it so you'll be looked after when I'm gone. I've put it where only you'll think to look. The safest place in the world, because it'll be moving, and nobody chases a moving thing. She shook her head slowly. I thought it was the whiskey talking. I never knew what he meant. I never asked. You don't ask a man like Preacher to explain his riddles. You just wait, and someday the riddle explains itself. She fell silent. And then, very slowly, her hand went still on the leather seat of the Revelator, and she turned and looked at the motorcycle, as if she were seeing it for the first time. And Duke Steele watched the understanding come up in her face, like dawn coming up over the desert. The safest place in the world, she whispered, because it'll be moving. And nobody chases a moving thing, Della Duke said. What are you? But she was already off the stool, already calling for Wendell, already pointing at the heavy steel oil tank that sat in the triangle of the Revelator's frame. The horseshoe tank that on a stock FXR holds 3 quarts of oil and nothing else. The one part of the motorcycle no thief and no mechanic and no curious soul would ever think to open. Because why on God's earth would a man hide anything in a tank full of hot oil? Drain the oil tank, Della said, and her voice was shaking now. Drain it and split the seam. Carefully. There's a false floor in there. I'd stake my life on it. He built it himself. That crazy, beautiful old man. He built me a hiding place inside the one part of his own bike that I would be the only living person to ever think to look in, because I'm the only one who knew the tank had room to spare. Drain it. Drain it right now. They drained it. The old oil came out black as tar, 11 years of it into the pan. And when the tank was empty, Clint Decker took a fine blade and worked the seam. Della pointed to a seam that should not have been there. A seam welded by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing, and the false floor of the oil tank lifted away. Inside, wrapped in 3 layers of wax canvas to keep the oil out, sealed tight, was a flat package the size of a hymnal. Della Vaughn took it in her 2 hands. She did not open it. Not yet. She held it against her chest, and she stood there in the cone of the drop light with 5 hard men around her, holding their breath, and the tears came down her old face freely now. And she said in a voice that was barely there at all, the way you speak to someone who has just stepped out of the room and might still hear you if you keep it quiet. You old fool. You stubborn, beautiful, lonesome old fool. You did keep your word. Both words. All these years. She pressed the package to her heart. I'm going to open it now, Silas. Whatever it is. I'm going to open it in front of these boys, and I'm going to let them see me. Is that all right? I think it's time somebody saw me. And in the small hours of that desert morning, with the Revelator finally whole on the lift behind her, and the memorial run a day away, and the foreclosure clock ticking down toward 9 o'clock Saturday, Della Vaughn carefully unwrapped the last secret of a dead man, layer by waxed layer, while the toughest motorcycle club in 4 states stood around an old woman in coveralls and watched and waited and bore witness at last. The first thing out of the wax canvas was a letter 4 pages written in a slanting, stubborn hand on the lined paper of a school notebook. And Della Vaughn's eyes went to the first line, and then she stopped and her chin trembled, and she held the pages out to Duke Steele. I can't, she said. My eyes, the light. You read it. Read it out loud. They earn the right to hear it, every one of them. Read it so my Wade can hear it too wherever he is. So Duke Steele, enforcer of the Desert Saints for 36 years, took the letter of his dead president in his huge, scarred hands, and in the gray hour before a desert dawn, with grown men standing bareheaded around an old woman, he read it out loud. And his voice broke more than once, and not one man there thought less of him for it. Della, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone. And the Revelator has finally thrown apart the way I always knew she would. And you are the only soul alive who could ever have fixed her, which means you are exactly where I always knew you would be, at the end, with your hands in my engine, and the truth coming out at last. I am glad. I have wanted it to come out for 40 years, and I never had the nerve, and now I am dead and out of excuses, so here it is. You were the best of us, better than Wade, and Wade was the best man I ever knew. better than me, and I built this whole club. Every engine that ever carried one of my brothers home alive came off your bench, and I let the whole world believe it came off mine. And I told myself I did it to protect you. And that was true. It was true. The world would have eaten a woman alone with a gift like yours, and I could not have stopped it. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was a proud man in a proud club, and it was easy to keep your secret. And somewhere along the years, keeping you hidden stopped being a way to save you and started being a way to keep the legend for myself. And I knew it, and I did it anyway. And I have been ashamed of it every single day, and I never once had the courage to say so to your face. So I am saying it now from the grave, where a coward can finally be brave. You are the dove. Not a story I told, not a ghost. A woman named Della Vaughn, the finest builder of iron the West has ever seen, and my dearest friend's widow, and the keeper of this whole club's beating heart for 50 years. And I am sorry, I am so deeply sorry that I let you grow old invisible. Make them say your name now, Della. Make them carve it somewhere. You have earned a name in stone. Duke had to stop there for a moment. Della had both hands pressed over her mouth and her shoulders shook. And Big Earl, the slab-shouldered Marine, had turned away to face the wall and was wiping his eyes with the back of one enormous hand. And Clint Decker stood with his jaw set hard and the tears running straight down into his collar, and not a man among them was ashamed. There is more Duke read on when he could. There is the matter of you being looked after because I know your pride. You stubborn woman, you would sooner starve on those 40 acres than take $1 from any man. And I have known it for 50 years, and I have planned around it accordingly. Behind this letter, you will find every reward I could never give you out in the open. For 31 years, every Christmas, after I drank my 1 cup of your coffee and told you the names of the living, I went home and I set aside $200 in cash, 1 bundle for each year, against the day you would need it, and I hid it in the one place on God's earth nobody would ever think to look, the belly of the bike you built, because I knew that someday that bike would break, and I knew that when it did, you would be the hand that opened her up. It is not charity, Della. It is wages. 50 years of wages, paid late, paid in full, by a man who owed you everything and gave you a cup of coffee a year. Take it. Pay your debts with it. Keep your land. Raise that little girl on the dirt where her grandfather is buried. And when you have done all that, build one more engine, just one, and stamp it with your own true name this time, and let the whole world finally know who the dove was. There was more under the letter, just as he had promised. Bundle after bundle of bills wrapped in waxed paper against the oil. 31 of them, each one tied with a strip of leather cut from an old cut. $200 to the bundle. $6,200 all told. The patient, secret, faithful savings of a lonely old man across 31 Christmas Eves. It was not $11,000. It was not enough to clear the arrears. But Duke Steele looked at that pile of leather-tied bundles on the workbench, the love of 3 decades laid bare. And then he looked at the old woman weeping with her hand on the bike she had built, and the last hard thing in him gave way entirely. And he made a decision that he did not put to a vote, because some decisions a president does not put to a vote. It's 6,200, he said quietly. You're behind 11. That leaves $4,800. He turned to his men, to the 4 saints who had ridden out into the dark with him, and the 3 mechanics who had been bent over that engine all night long. And there are going to be 60, 70 brothers rolling into this town tomorrow at dawn from 4 states. Every one of them come to honor a man this woman kept alive for 50 years without a one of us knowing her name. His jaw worked. I do not believe for 1 second that I will have any trouble at all raising $4,800 off 100 grateful bikers before 9 o'clock Saturday morning. Not 1 second of trouble. I told you, Della started, the old pride flaring even through her tears. I will not take charity. I will not. It is not charity, Duke Steele said, and he said it gentle, but he said it with the full and final weight of a man who has made up his mind. You heard the man's letter. It's wages, 50 years overdue. And you are going to take it, Delavon, every dollar of it, not because you can't stand on your own. God knows you've stood on your own longer than any of us has been alive. But because there comes a day in a person's life when the only strong thing left to do, the only thing braver than carrying it alone, is to finally let the people who love you carry it with you. His voice gentled further still. We are your people now. Preacher made sure of it. He spent his last words on this earth making sure of it. Don't you dishonor the man by saying no. And in the gray light of that desert dawn, the proudest woman in 4 states, who had carried everything alone for 50 years, who had built a legend with her own 2 hands, and let it grow famous while she grew old and unseen behind, it looked at the men gathered around her, and at the bike she had built, and at the letter of the man who had loved her in the only broken way he knew how. And she did the hardest thing she had ever done in the whole of her hard life. She let them. All right, Delavon whispered. All right, thank you. Yes, it was the first time in 50 years she had let anyone carry anything for her at all. From the doorway of the office, a small voice spoke into the quiet. Grandma. Maisie stood there in the gray light, Big Earl's leather cut still hanging off her thin shoulders like a king's robe, her crooked braids askew from sleep. Her grandmother's same level dark eyes taking in the weeping men and the open bike and the pile of money on the bench. Grandma, are you crying because we get to keep the house? And Della crossed that floor on her bad hip faster than she had moved in 20 years, and she gathered her granddaughter up in her arms, and she held her so tight, and she said into the top of the child's head, fierce and broken, and finally, unafraid, yes, baby, yes, we get to keep the house. We get to keep everything. We're going to be just fine. By the time the sun cleared the eastern range, the Revelator was whole. She sat on the lift in the center of the bay, wiped down and gleaming the custom push rods, seated, the timing locked, the hidden switch wired, clean, the new battery charged and ready. And she looked less like a dead machine than like a great black animal sleeping, waiting only to be woken. Sawyer's hand hovered over the ignition. Should we fire her up just to be sure just once? No, Della said. She was sitting on her stool, gray-faced with exhaustion, holding her granddaughter against her side. But her voice was iron. We don't fire her in a garage. Preacher Boone didn't spend 31 Christmas Eves saving for me, so I could waste the first breath of his bike on an empty shop with the doors closed. She looked at the motorcycle a long moment, and something fierce and tender crossed her old face. The first time that engine speaks in 11 years, it's going to speak at the head of his run, with the whole Brotherhood gathered round, and the sun coming up the way he'd have wanted it. Not before. We've checked every bolt twice. She'll run. I built her to run. We wait. So they waited. They wheeled the Revelator out and chained her gentle onto the flatbed under her blue blanket, and they killed the drop lights, and the men dispersed to a few hours' broken sleep on benches and in truck cabs, and the desert went quiet, and Della took Maisie back into the corner office and held her while the child slept, and the old woman did not sleep at all, but only sat there watching the gray light come up stronger through the dusty window, holding everything she had almost lost. She was the only one awake near 5 in the morning when the dog began to bark. There was no dog at Decker's Cycle Works. The bark came from down the road, the junkyard mutt at the wrecking lot, the one that barked at coyotes and headlights and nothing else. And Della Vaughn, who had spent 50 years being invisible and had learned in that time that the great reward of being unseen is that you get to see everything, knew the difference between a dog barking at a coyote and a dog barking at a man. She did not wake the others. She slipped out of the office on her bad hip, quiet as the ghost they had named her, and she eased open the side door of the dark garage, and she stood in the shadow and she watched. A figure had come over the back fence, a big man's shaved head catching the first gray light, moving low along the row of the flatbed truck where the Revelator lay chained under her blanket. Brock Riggs. He had a flashlight cupped in one hand to hide its glow, and a small tool roll in the other, and he went straight to the left side of the motorcycle, to the tank, and he peeled the blanket back, and he reached his hand up under the lip of the tank, exactly where the hidden switch lived, exactly where no living soul but Della and the dead man should have known to reach. Of course he knew. His drunk daddy had given him the secret along with the bruises. Della understood at once what he was doing and why. He could not steal the bike, not from a lot full of sleeping saints, but he could make sure it never ran. He could reach up under that tank in the dark and cut the wire to the hidden switch, or jam the toggle, or simply break it off in the closed position, and the revelator would crank and crank in front of the whole assembled Brotherhood at dawn, and never, ever catch. And Duke Steele would be humiliated, and the run would be ruined, and Preacher's memory would die in a cloud of starter motor whine, and Brock Riggs would stand in the back of the crowd with his arms crossed and watch the sentimental old fool fail, and then he would foreclose on the famous Dove by lunchtime and own the lot of them. It was a small, mean, perfect plan. What Brock Riggs did not know, crouched there in the dark, with his hand up under the tank, was that he was not the only one awake, and he was not the only one watching, because a thin girl of 9 with 2 crooked braids had also heard the dog, and had also slipped out the way children slip out, and was standing now in the shadow of the open office door, not 10 feet from her grandmother, both of them silent, both of them watching the big man's hand move under the tank, both of them memorizing every second of it. Della reached out in the dark and found her granddaughter's shoulder and squeezed it once, the old signal between them that meant, be still, be quiet, watch. And Maisie was still, and Maisie was quiet, and Maisie watched, and her grandmother's same-level dark eyes did not blink. Brock Riggs worked at the switch for the better part of a minute. Then he tugged the blanket back down over the bike, smoothing it so nobody would know it had been touched. And he melted back along the truck and over the fence into the graying dark. And the junkyard dog stopped barking, and the desert was quiet again. Della Vaughn let out a slow breath. She did not wake Duke. She did not run out to check the switch. She did not raise the alarm. 50 years of being unseen had taught her a deeper kind of patience than the kind that fixes a problem the moment it appears. She knew exactly what Brock Riggs had done. She knew exactly how to undo it because she had built it, and there was no part of that motorcycle her hands did not know in the dark. And she knew, with a cold, clear certainty that settled over her like the dawn coming up over the range, that the most powerful thing she could do was nothing at all. Let him think it was done. Let him come to the run, smug and sure. Let him stand in the back with his arms crossed and wait to watch them fail. And then let the whole Brotherhood watch what happened instead. Did you see his face, Grandma? Maisie whispered. What was he doing to the bike? He was trying to break Mr. Preacher's heart one more time, Della said softly. Even though Mr. Preacher's already gone. Some men are like that baby. They can't stand a beautiful thing they didn't make. But you and me, we saw him do it, didn't we? With our own eyes. And nobody ever sees us. That's our secret. That's always been our secret. She drew the child close. Now you listen to me. In a little while, when all the motorcycles come, that bike is going to crank, and it's not going to start, and everybody is going to be scared and sad. And I'm going to need you to be brave, and I'm going to need you to do something very small with your little hand, something only your little hand can reach easy. And when you do it, everything is going to be all right. Can you be brave for me one more time? Maisie looked up at her grandmother with the steadiness of a child who had already been brave more times than any child should have to be. I can be brave, she said. And out across the desert, faint at first and then growing, came a sound like distant thunder that was not thunder. A low, rolling, rising roar that climbed the morning from every direction at once. From the highways, in the back roads, in the passes, the sound of the Brotherhood coming in. And Della Vaughn stood in the doorway of the little garage with her granddaughter's hand in hers, and listened to the iron come home. They came in by twos and threes and tens down out of the dawn headlights, still burning against the pink eastern sky, and they filled the gravel lot of Decker Cycle Works and overflowed it into the road in the field beyond, rank on rank of leather and chrome. And when the last of them had killed his engine, and the great rolling thunder finally fell away into silence, there were 71 motorcycles gathered in the cool of the desert morning, and 71 men and women of the Desert Saints and their allied clubs stood bareheaded in the gray light waiting to ride a dead man home. And not one of them, not a single soul in that whole gathered brotherhood, knew yet that the small white-haired woman in the old blue coveralls, standing quiet at the edge of it, holding a little girl's hand, was about to walk out into the center of them all, and finally, after 50 years, be seen. Duke Steele climbed up onto the bed of the flatbed truck, where the blanketed shape of the Revelator lay, and he stood there above the gathered brotherhood with the rising sun behind him, and the murmuring of 71 riders fell away to nothing. "You all knew Silas Boone," Duke began, and his voice carried clear across the still morning air. "Preacher, some of you he pulled out of the gutter like me. Some of you he stood up at your wedding. Some of you he buried your father, or your brother, or your son, and held you while you couldn't stand. There's not a man or woman in this lot whose life he didn't touch, and there's not one of us who's been whole since he left it." He paused, and the silence held. "Tradition says his bike leads him home. You all heard she was dead. You all heard the best wrenches in 3 states gave up on her. Well," a flicker of something crossed his weathered face, "word got around wrong. She was never dead. She was only locked. And there was exactly one person left alive who had the key." He looked down out into the crowd and found the small, white-haired woman at the edge of it. "Della Vaughn," Duke Steele said, "come up here." A ripple went through the brotherhood. Heads turned. Who? The cleaning woman. The old gal from the back of Decker's shop. But Brock Riggs, standing near the rear of the pack, with his arms crossed exactly as Della had known he would be, went very still, and the smug certainty on his face curdled into the first cold edge of doubt. Della Vaughn walked out into the center of 71 motorcycles on her bad hip with her granddaughter's hand in hers, and she climbed up onto the flatbed beside the giant, slow refusing help, and she stood there before them all, narrow as a fence rail, white hair pulled back. Hard grease worked so deep into the creases of her old hands that 50 years of washing had never gotten it out. And she faced the brotherhood, and she did not look afraid. "Most of you don't know me," she said, and her voice was thin, but it did not waver. "That was the arrangement. For 50 years, that was the whole arrangement." She drew a breath. "My husband was Wade Vaughn. He was one of the 7 men who started this club with Preacher in a borrowed garage in 1971. And he died on a wet pass in 78, keeping his bike off a car full of strangers. And he was 29 years old." A stir went through the older riders. A few of the gray-bearded men in the front straightened the name, reaching them across 40 years. "And from the night we buried him until the night he died, Silas Boone brought every broken engine in this club to me, in the dark, off the books, under my husband's name, and I fixed them. All of them. Every motor that ever carried one of you home alive across half a century came off my bench, built by these 2 hands. And Preacher let the world believe it was a ghost, and he gave the ghost a name." She lifted her chin. "Some of you old ones have said that name over a beer. He called me the Dove." The silence that fell over that lot was the deepest silence the desert had heard in 100 years. The Dove, the legend, the story they thought Preacher made up to keep them humble. The ghost nobody had ever met. Standing on a flatbed in old blue coveralls, holding a little girl's hand, 74 years old real. One of the graybeards in the front row took off his cap, then another. Then down the long ranks of them, rank by rank, 71 bareheaded riders, the men and women of 4 states worth of brotherhood, took off their caps for an old woman they had never known was real. And in the back, Brock Riggs uncrossed his arms. "Now," Della said, and she turned to the blanketed shape on the truck beside her. "Let's wake him up." Duke Steele drew the blanket back, and there she was, the revelator, black and low and gleaming in the morning sun. And a low sound went through the crowd, half a sigh and half a prayer. Duke swung his huge leg over her, settled his weight into the saddle that still held the shape of his dead president, and looked back at the old woman. "Foreman," he said, "she's yours. Say the word." "Turn the key," Della said. Duke turned the key. The headlight bloomed to life. He gripped the bars and he took a breath, and the whole Brotherhood took it with him. 71 held breaths in the cool desert morning. And he pressed the starter. The engine cranked, clean and strong and even. It cranked, and it did not catch. No spark, no combustion, just the hollow, whirring spin of a starter motor turning over a dead machine. The exact sound the best mechanics in 3 states had been beaten by the sound of a heart that would not beat. A murmur ran through the crowd, low and dismayed. Duke took his thumb off the starter. He tried again. Crank, and nothing. Nothing at all. Clint Decker had gone white. Big Earl's hands had curled into fists. Sawyer turned away. And in the back slow, the smug smile crept back across Brock Riggs's face because his small, mean, perfect plan had worked. The wire was cut. The bike was dead. The old fool was humiliated in front of the whole Brotherhood, and the dove had failed. And 40 acres of solar money was his by lunchtime. Duke Steele looked back at Della, and the disappointment and the grief in his face were almost more than the old woman could bear. And the whole lot of them stood there in the dawn, with the dead man's bike refusing to speak, and their hearts going down into the dirt. "You forgot something," Della Vaughn said. The words cut across the murmuring crowd, clear and calm, and every head turned to her. She was not looking at the bike. She was looking out into the crowd out toward the back, and her level, dark eyes had found Brock Riggs and locked onto him and would not let go, and the smile died on his face under the weight of that old, patient gaze. The gaze of a woman nobody ever sees, who therefore sees everything. "It's not broken," Della said to the whole Brotherhood, but never taking her eyes off Riggs. "It was never broken. I built her too good to break. But somebody got into this lot in the dark this morning around 5 o'clock and reached up under the left side of the tank where only 2 people on this earth knew there was anything to reach for. And he yanked the wire loose from the hidden switch, ripped the connector clean apart up in that tight space behind the tank, hoping she'd crank in front of all of you, and never catch, hoping you'd think the dove had lost her touch, hoping to bury Preacher Boone's memory in a cloud of starter noise so he could foreclose on his widow's friend by lunchtime and pave her grandfather's grave with a solar field. She let it land, the whole terrible accusation, in the dead still morning air. I know that's what he did. I know exactly what he did, because my granddaughter and I stood 10 feet away in the dark and watched him do it with our own 2 pairs of eyes. 71 heads turned slow toward the back of the lot, toward the big, bald man, standing alone now in a widening circle of empty gravel. And the look on Brock Riggs's face was the look of a man who has spent his whole life unseen by the people who mattered, and has just discovered far too late that one old woman had been watching him the entire time. "That's a lie," Riggs said, but his voice came out thin. "That's a crazy old woman, and a little kid you can't—" "Maisie," Della said gently, "tell them what you saw." And the thin girl with the 2 crooked braids stepped to the edge of the flatbed, small and steady, her grandmother's same level eyes, sweeping the whole gathered Brotherhood, and she pointed one little finger straight at Brock Riggs, and in a clear, high voice that carried to the very back of that lot of hardened riders, she said the 11 words that ended him. "That man climbed the fence and broke Mr. Preacher's bike this morning." For one long moment, nobody in that lot of 71 hardened riders moved at all. Then it began low at first, a sound that started somewhere in the front rank among the gray-bearded men who had ridden with Wade Vaughn, 40 years gone, and had just learned his widow's name. And it spread back through the Brotherhood rank by rank, like a wind moving through dry grass. A deep, collective growl of pure outrage. The sound of 70 men who have just learned that one of their own crept over a fence in the dark to spit on a dead president's memory and steal an old widow's home. They turned toward Brock Riggs, all of them, and they began slow to close the circle. "It's business," Riggs said, backing up a step, his voice climbing. "She can't pay her note. That's arithmetic. You can't put a man out of the club over arithmetic." "You used what you knew about this club," Duke Steele said from the flatbed, and his voice was the quietest it had been all morning, which was the most frightening thing of all. "To hunt down a brother's widow and take the dirt her husband is buried in. You used Preacher's death before the man was cold to make yourself rich off the one soul he spent 50 years protecting. And then you crawled over a fence in the dark to sabotage his memorial so the whole world would think she'd failed." He stepped down off the truck slow, and the Brotherhood parted to let him through, and he walked toward Brock Riggs across the gravel with the unhurried certainty of an avalanche. "There is no patch on this earth big enough to cover what you are." He stopped in front of Riggs, and he reached out, and with 2 fingers he took hold of the death's head on the front of the man's cut. "Give it to me," Duke said. "You can't. Give me the patch, Brock. You're done. By the bylaws you swore to, and broke by the vote of every brother standing in this lot, and by the grave of the man you tried to disgrace this morning, you are out. Take it off, or I will take it off you. And only one of those ends with you riding out of here on your own 2 wheels." For a moment, Brock Riggs looked around the circle at 70 faces with no mercy left in any of them. And whatever he had spent his whole hungry life believing the world owed him, drained out of his face and left it gray and empty and small. And he understood finally and completely the way only a small man at the bottom of a deep hole understands it, that he had lost. He shrugged out of his cut with shaking hands and let it fall to the gravel at Duke's boots. And the Brotherhood watched him in a silence worse than any shouting, and he turned and walked to his bike with his shoulders hunched and his head down, a man with no club and no name. And he fired it up and he rode out of Dry Fork, and not one soul watched him go, because the moment his back was turned, every eye in that lot had already gone back to the old woman on the flatbed where it belonged. "As for the note on her land," Duke said, raising his voice now so it carried across the whole Brotherhood, "the holding company that bought that paper was Brock Riggs, hiding behind lawyers. And Brock Riggs is finished, and a man can't foreclose on a widow from the wrong side of a club he's been thrown out of." He looked at Della, and the corner of his hard mouth turned up. "But just to be sure that snake can never raise his head again, there's a fellow standing right over there named Raymond Holden, the same fellow who came out here yesterday waving paperwork, and he is going to take a cashier's payment this very morning in full that reinstates that loan and kills that sale forever. And he is going to do it gladly because 71 motorcycles are about to ride past his office at 9 o'clock. And I expect a man can be very reasonable with that kind of congregation watching." A low rumble of grim laughter went through the crowd. 6,200 from Preacher's own hand. "And the rest, brothers." He did not even finish the question. Already all across that lot, hands were going into vests and saddlebags, 20s and 50s, and hundreds folded and crumpled and pressed forward, and Sawyer pulled off his own cap and held it out. And it went down the ranks hand to hand, and by the time it had made one slow circuit of 71 grateful riders, it was so full of folded bills that it would not hold the shape of a cap anymore, and it was a great deal more than $4,800. And Della Vaughn stood on the flatbed and watched it come, and could not say a single word because there were no words left in her at all. "That's settled then," Duke said softly, and turned back to the bike. "Now there's only one thing left undone." He looked up at the old woman and then at the little girl beside her. "Foreman, you said you needed a small hand." Della Vaughn knelt down slow on her bad hip on the bed of that flatbed truck, and she brought herself level with her granddaughter, and she took the child's small face in her 2 grease-creased hands the way she had 100 times. "Maisie," she said, "remember how I told you you'd have to be brave one more time? It's now. That bad man pulled a little wire apart way up behind the tank in a place too tight for my old hands and way too tight for Mr. Steele's big ones. But it's just the right size for yours. I'm going to lift you up and I'm going to guide your hand, and I need you to push two little pieces of metal back together until you feel them click. Just like snapping two beads, that's all. Can you do that? That's all, Maisie said. That's the brave thing. That's the brave thing, baby. The bravest thing in the whole world is a small hand doing what only it can do. So Big Earl lifted the little girl up, gentle as a feather, and held her over the engine. And Della guided that small hand up under the lip of the tank into the dark, tight space behind it, the child's fingers feeling their way along the wire to the two parted halves of the connector. And the whole Brotherhood went silent, 71 riders holding their breath in the morning sun, while a 9-year-old girl with crooked braids reached into the heart of a dead man's motorcycle. I feel them, Maisie whispered, the two pieces. Push them together, baby, hard as you can, till they click. Della felt the small arms strain. She heard the child grunt with effort. And then, faint but unmistakable from up under the tank, came a tiny, beautiful, decisive sound. Click. I did it, Maisie cried. Grandma, I felt it click. I did it. Earl set her down. Della rose to her feet slow and laid her own swollen hand for a moment, flat on the cam cover of the bike she had built with her own two hands, 40 years before the iron warm, already with the morning sun. And she closed her eyes, and she said very low, just for the machine and the man it belonged to, "All right, you old fool, let's go home." Then she opened her eyes and she looked at Duke Steele, and she said one word, "Now." Duke Steele swung back into the saddle. He set his boot, gripped the bars, turned the key a second time, and the headlight burned steady and strong. He reached his huge hand up under the left side of the tank, found the little hidden toggle right where it had lived for 40 years, and threw it. Then he looked once at the old woman, and once at the little girl, and once up at the brightening sky where a stubborn dead man might be watching, and he pressed the starter. For half a heartbeat, there was only the clean spin of the motor, and then the revelator caught. She did not start so much as detonate a single enormous concussion of sound that slammed across that lot and rolled out into the open desert and came rolling back off the distant range a full second later. And then she settled into an idle. But it was not the tidy idle of an ordinary machine. It was a deep, lumpy, uneven, hard-hitting thunder, the unmistakable heartbeat of a hand-built, high-compression V-twin that no factory ever made, and no two of which ever sounded alike. The sound of a Frankenstein monster come alive on the table. The sound of fire and brimstone in 40 years of memory. The sound that had led every desert saint home for 38 years and had been silent for 3 long months. It was the sound of Silas Boone. Duke Steele sat frozen on that bike with the engine thundering between his knees, and the great hard man who had not wept at his own president's funeral, who had carried the whole grieving club on his shoulders for 3 months without once breaking, felt the tears come up hot and sudden and unstoppable. Because the engine did not just sound like an old motorcycle, it sounded like his friend. It sounded like the man who had picked him up out of the mud in El Paso in the rain. It sounded exactly, precisely down to the last uneven beat, like the brother they had buried speaking to them once more across the only distance no road can close. And all across that lot, 71 riders who had ridden in to mourn a man stood in the rising sun with the tears running down into their gray beards. And then one by one, and then all at once, they began to fire up their own machines in answer. 70 bikes roaring to life around the resurrected revelator, until the whole desert morning shook with a thunder you could feel in the marrow of your bones. The Brotherhood lifting its voice in the only hymn it knew. And over the top of all of it, clear and high and joyful, came the sound of a 9-year-old girl laughing and clapping her hands, because her small, brave hand had woken the dead. Della Vaughn stood in the center of it all in her old blue coveralls, and she let herself for one moment simply be there, alive, seen, surrounded, her life's work thundering beneath her hand, and her granddaughter laughing at her side, and 70 strangers weeping for joy over the iron she had built in the dark and never been thanked for. And she thought of Wade, and she thought of Preacher, and she thought of every long invisible year, and she did not regret a single one of them. Because they had all, every last one brought her here to this morning, to this sound, to this being seen at last. Duke Steele let the engine settle. Then he climbed down off the revelator, and he turned to the old woman, and over the idling thunder of 70 machines, he said the thing that no one had ever said to her in 50 years. "It's your bike, Della. You built her. You leads him home." Della Vaughn shook her head, and for a moment the old refusal rose in her, the lifetime of standing back, of staying in the dark, of letting others take the seat. And then she looked at the worn leather saddle that held the shape of a dead man, and she looked at her own two hands, and she thought very clearly, I am 74 years old, and I have built 1,000 motorcycles, and I have ridden almost none of them. And if not now, when? And if not me, who? "My hip won't hold a bike that size on a long ride," she said. And it was true, and it cost her to admit it. "But I'll ride to the courthouse. I'll ride that far, and then I'll let you take the long road to the chapel, because that road belongs to all of you. And my road only has to go as far as showing one banker that the dove is still alive." She put one hand on the saddle. "Help an old woman up, Mr. Steele." He helped her up. She settled onto the revelator, small and straight-backed, her boots barely reaching the pegs. And Duke walked beside her with one steadying hand near her shoulder, and Maisie rode pillion behind Big Earl on his great chromed machine, holding tight and grinning ear to ear. And at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning, 71 motorcycles rolled out of the gravel lot of Decker Cycle Works in a thunder that woke the whole sleeping town, with a 74-year-old woman at the head of them, on the bike she had built, leading the Brotherhood down the main street of Dry Fork toward the county courthouse, and the man who thought he was about to take her home. Word travels fast in a small desert town, even at dawn. By the time the great rolling thunder reached the courthouse square, people had come out onto their porches in their robes to watch. And the watching was a thing in itself, because the whole town had known Della Vaughn for years as the quiet old woman who swept the floor at Decker's, the one nobody quite saw. And now here she came at the head of 70 bikers on a machine that shook the windows in their frames. Straight-backed and white-haired and absolutely unafraid, and the town did not know what it was looking at, only that it was looking at something it would tell its grandchildren about. Raymond Holden was already on the courthouse steps. He had come early in his clean, short-sleeved shirt and his tie with his leather folder and a small folding table to conduct the trustees' sale of 40 acres at 9 o'clock sharp, expecting one bidder and a quiet morning. What he got instead was 71 motorcycles filling the square, wall to wall, their engines thundering, and then, at a raised hand from Duke Steele, falling silent all at once into a quiet so total that Holden could hear his own heart. And at the head of them, riding straight up to the bottom of the courthouse steps, an old woman on a black motorcycle, who looked at him the way the desert looks at a man who has wandered too far from his water. Della Vaughn shut off the engine. The silence rang. "Mr. Holden," she said, "you came out to my property yesterday with a paper that said I owed $11,000 by 9 o'clock this morning, or you'd sell my home out from under me and my grandchild." She nodded to Sawyer, who came forward and set the cap, heavy and overflowing with cash, on the little folding table. "There's your 11,000. There's a good deal more than your 11,000, as a matter of fact, paid in full by me and by these 71 people behind me, with the wages a dead man left me hidden in the belly of his own motorcycle. Count it. Take what's owed. Mark that account current and that sale canceled, and you write it down on paper, and you sign it, and you hand it to me before you so much as touch a key again." She leaned forward slightly on the bike. "And then I'd like my 40 acres back, free and clear of that snake's lawyers and his solar money and his lies, The same 40 acres my husband is buried on, where I intend to die a great many years from now, an old woman in her own bed, with her name on her own mailbox. Are we understood? Raymond Holden looked at the overflowing cap of money, and he looked at the 71 silent riders filling the square, and he looked at the small, fierce old woman on the great black bike, and he was not a brave man, and he was not a cruel man. He was only a portfolio manager who had been hired to do a job by a client who he was beginning to understand with great clarity was no longer anyone he wished to be associated with. He counted the money. It was, as she had said, a good deal more than enough. He filled out the reinstatement on the spot, his hands a little unsteady, and he signed it, and he stamped it, and he handed it down to her, and he canceled the sale aloud to the empty square. And then, because there was nothing else to be done, and because the morning had taken a turn, he would be telling his own grandchildren about Raymond Holden. The banker took off his hat to the dove and got in his clean gray car and drove away. And the dust of him settled fast and clean, the way the dust of a problem settles once it is truly, finally over. Della Vaughn held the signed paper in her two hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she folded it once and tucked it into the breast pocket of her chambray shirt over her heart, and she turned the key and she fired up the revelator one more time. And over the thunder of it, she called out to Duke Steele, the only thing left to say. "That's my part done, Mr. Steele." Her old eyes were bright. "Now take him to the chapel. Take preacher home. And I'll be standing right here in this square when you ride back through, every last one of you, to watch you go because I built half those engines. And I've got a right to hear them run." Duke Steele did not move toward the bike right away. He stood there in the square with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the old woman astride the revelator, the great black machine thundering under her like a thing that knew whose grip it was meant for. And something passed over the big man's face that none of the brothers behind him had ever seen there before. Not in 36 years, not at funerals, nor in courtrooms, nor in the back rooms where the club's worst nights were decided. It was something close to reverence, and it was something close to grief. And it was more than either of those, a kind of apology that a proud man can only ever make with his whole body and never with his mouth. He came across the cobblestones slow and bareheaded, and when he reached her, he did not put his hand out for the bars. He put it out for her. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out rough. "Della, I rode behind that man for 36 years, and I never once knew that the sound under me belonged to you. You let us carry his name up and down this country like it was the only name that mattered, and the whole time the hands that gave us that sound were turning a wrench in the dark, 40 miles from our own clubhouse, and not a one of us ever thought to ask. That's on us. That's on every patch in this square, and I am too old and too plain a man to fix 50 years of that with a pretty speech. So I am only going to say the one true thing I have got." He swallowed. "It would be the honor of my life to ride his ashes to that chapel on the bike that you built. But I will not take these bars from your hands. You crank that throttle, and you point her where she goes. We will follow you, every one of us, the way we should have been following you all along." For a moment, the old woman said nothing. The revelator hammered out its uneven, heavy idol beneath her, the sound she had tuned with her own ear, half a century before, the heartbeat of a man who was ash in a brass urn now, and had loved her too clumsily to ever say so out loud. And Della Vaughn shook her head slow, and the refusal in it was gentle and absolute. "No, Mr. Steele," she said. "I built her to carry him, and she has only got the one more ride in her that matters, and it isn't mine. I had my ride already this morning into this square to put a banker in his place and take my land back, and that was the only road I ever needed her for." She looked down at the tank, at the chipped paint over the steel she had hammered true with her own hands in 1985, and she laid her palm flat against it, the way a person lays a palm against a horse they are about to send away forever. "You take her. You put him on that bluff above the water where he asked to go. And when you bring her back through this square, you bring her back empty, And that will be the two of them gone, the same morning, the bike and the man, and I will have made my peace with both. Her chin lifted. Now get on. The morning's wasting, and Preacher always did hate to be kept waiting. So Duke Steele swung his leg over the revelator, and the old woman stepped down off her into his keeping. And a prospect came forward, soft and careful, carrying the brass urn wrapped in the dead president's own cut. And they fixed it upright and lashed it sure to the sissy bar where a passenger would ride, so that Silas Boone would lead his own memorial run home, the way every founder before him had led his, on the bike that bore his legend. Except that this founder rode pillion behind the truth of who had truly built it. Duke settled his weight. He found the bars. And the old enforcer who had not wept at his own wife's grave sat a long moment on a stranger's idling machine with his jaw working and his eyes wet. And then he lifted one heavy-gloved hand into the high desert morning, and 70 other engines woke at once down the length of the square. And the sound of them rolled up off the cobblestones and broke against the old stone faces of the buildings like a tide coming in. They went out of Dry Fork slow, in a column too wide, the revelator at the head of them, with its ghost lashed upright behind, and the people of the town came out onto the wooden sidewalks to watch them go. The man from the feed store came out in his apron. The woman from the diner came out with a dish towel still in her hands. The children pressed against the rails of the porches with their mouths open at the thunder of it, and old men who had fought in wars stood up off their benches and took their caps off their heads the way you do when something passes that is bigger than you. And nobody in that town fully understood what they were seeing, only that the small, fierce mechanic who fixed their tractors and their pickups for 40 years was standing alone in the middle of the square with a 9-year-old girl's hand in hers, watching 70 outlaws carry a dead man out of town on a motorcycle she had built. And that whatever it was the realest thing that had ever happened in Dry Fork. And they would all of them tell it wrong for the rest of their lives and never come close to how it actually felt. Della stood and watched the last of them go small in the heat shimmer at the edge of town, the thunder of them folding down into a murmur and then into nothing until the square was quiet again, and there was only the wind and the flag snapping on its pole over the courthouse, and the small, warm weight of Maisie leaning into her side. "Gran," the girl said after a while, "where are they taking Mr. Preacher's bike?" Della was quiet a moment. "To a high place above the water," she said, "where the wind never quits. He asked to be let go from up there so the wind could carry him out over everything." Maisie thought about that. "Will the bike come back?" "It'll come back, baby." "Will he?" And the old woman looked down at the child she had raised out of the wreckage of her own daughter's death. The child she had nearly lost. The roof over. The child whose small, steady hand had reached into the guts of a dead machine the night before and reconnected a wire that grown men with 40 years of grease under their nails had not been able to find. And she felt the whole long ache of her life settle in her chest and turn somehow into something that was almost peace. "No sugar," she said softly. "He won't, but that's all right. Some folks you don't get back. You just get to be the one who keeps them running a little longer than they had any right to." She squeezed the small hand. "Come on, let's go sit in the diner and have us a piece of pie while we wait. We earned it. Lord knows we earned it." The run climbed up out of the desert basin all that long morning, 71 engines hammering in a column up the old highway that bent north and west toward the high country, and the land changed under them, the way it does, the gray sage flats giving way to red rock, and then to the first dark green of the pines as the road climbed, and Duke Steele rode at the point of it on the revelator, with the wind taking the tears off his face before they could fall, so that any brother who pulled up alongside saw only a stone-faced old enforcer doing his duty, which was exactly the mercy the wind had always done for men like him. The bike ran perfect. It ran better than perfect. It ran the way a thing runs when it has finally been understood, the heavy, uneven thunder of it smoothing out into a kind of song at speed, and Duke felt it under him, And he thought about the small old woman's hands that had made it sing. And he thought about all the years he had ridden behind that exact sound, believing it was Preacher's genius. And he understood for the first time in his life what it must be to give a gift so large and so quiet that the man you give it to gets to spend his whole life being loved for it by other people, while you stand in the dark and watch, and never once correct them. He did not have a word for that kind of love. He only knew it was the largest thing he had ever been close to, and that it had been riding 40 miles outside his own clubhouse the entire time, fixing carburetors for ranchers, and that he had nearly let a man like Brock Riggs put it out on the road in its old age for the price of a solar lease. The chapel sat on a bluff at the end of the highway where the land simply stopped and fell away to the great wind-scoured water below a little whitewashed thing barely bigger than a tool shed built 100 years before by people whose names nobody remembered, kept up since by nobody at all, except the wind and whatever riders came up to stand at the edge and feel small. There was no priest. There had never been a priest. The desert saints had been coming to this bluff to scatter their dead for 40 years because Silas Boone had found it on a ride in his 20s and declared it the only church he would ever kneel in. And now they brought him to it, 71 of them, and they shut their engines off all at once. And the silence after the thunder was so total that men flinched at it. They unlashed the urn. Duke held it. The brothers formed a loose horseshoe at the edge of the bluff, with a long fall of air and water at their backs. And they took their hats off, and the wind came up the face of the cliff, cold and clean and steady. And Duke Steele stood at the lip of the world, with the ashes of his president in his two hands, and found that all the things he had meant to say had gone out of his head entirely. So he said the only thing that was left. "Brothers," he said, and the wind took it and gave it back. "We came up here to put a great man into the wind, and we will. In a minute, we will. But I'd be a liar and a coward if I let you do it without telling you what I learned at 4 o'clock this morning in a dirt yard outside of Dry Fork, because Preacher himself put it in writing and asked me to make sure of it, and I am not going to be the man who failed him on the last thing." He looked around the horseshoe of weathered faces. "Every one of you has ridden behind the sound of the Revelator. Every one of you thought that sound was Silas Boone. It wasn't. That sound was a woman named Della Vaughn, who built that engine with her own hands 50 years ago, who built half the legendary engines this club ever ran, and who let our founder carry her name up and down this country as his own, because she lived in a time and a place that would not let a woman be what she was. Preacher knew. Preacher kept her secret 50 years because she asked him to, and he loved her the whole time, and he never said it. And last night he said all of it from beyond the grave in 4 pages of school paper, and he asked us his last order to this club to make her name known and to carve it somewhere it would last. Duke's voice cracked, and he let it. So we are going to do that. We are going to do every bit of that. But first, we are going to put him in the wind, knowing that all of us finally know who he really was, which was a man who could keep the biggest secret in the world for 50 years out of love. There's worse things to be remembered for. There's nothing better." And he tipped the urn, and the wind took Silas Boone off that bluff in a long, pale ribbon and carried him out over the water, out and out, until there was nothing of him left to see, and 71 outlaws stood bareheaded in the cold, clean air and let him go, and not one of them was ashamed of his face. For a long while after no man moved to leave, they stood at the lip of the bluff with the wind coming up cold and clean off the water, and they let the silence hold, because there are silences that a man does not break for the same reason he does not put his boot through a church window, and this was one of them. The sun was high and hard over the water, and the light came up off it in a million broken pieces. And somewhere down the long fall of air, a hawk hung on the wind without moving its wings, and the brothers stood and watched it, and thought their own thoughts about the man they had just given back to the sky. It was an old brother named Gus Tillman who finally spoke the oldest patch in the club, A man who had ridden with Silas Boone before there was a club at all, back when it was just four young fools in a dream and a borrowed welding torch. And his voice when it came was thin and cracked with age, but it carried in the still air. "I remember that engine," Gus said. He was looking out at the water. "First time I ever heard the Revelator run must have been 85, 86. Preacher rode it into the lot at the old clubhouse, and we all came out to hear it. And I will tell you boys, not one of us had ever heard anything like it. That sound." He shook his white head slow. "We all thought Silas built it. He never said he did. I want you to hear that. In 40 years, I never once heard that man say with his own mouth that he built that motor. We just all decided he had because who else? And he let us decide it, and he stood there in the lot that day and took it. And the whole time." The old man's voice wobbled and steadied. "The whole time there was a young woman 40 miles out in the sage who'd machined that cam by hand and timed it by ear, and he was protecting her, and we never knew. And I rode behind that lie for 40 years and loved him for it and never knew it was a lie at all. That's not a small thing a man does. To carry a gift like that and never once set it down to take the credit. I don't know that I could have done it. I don't believe most men could." He turned from the water and looked at the others, at Duke holding the empty urn, at the horseshoe of bare gray heads. "Preacher asked us in that letter to make her a saint," Gus said. "Honorary by the bylaw he wrote himself. Now I have been in this club longer than any soul standing here, and I have seen us turn down hard men who bled for the patch, because the patch is the patch, and you do not give it away. But I am telling you, every one of you with whatever standing 40 years buys a man, that there is not a soul, living or dead, more deserving of our colors than Delavon. And if there's a man here who'd vote against it, let him say so now to my face in front of Preacher's wind. And we'll have it out, him and me, old as I am." No man said a word. The wind said it for them. "Then it's done," Duke said quietly. "It's done, and it's right. And Preacher can rest easy that we got the last thing right." He looked down at the empty urn in his hands, the founder's cut still wrapped around it. "I'll read you the rest of it, the part I couldn't get through this morning in her yard, the part about her." And he drew the 4 folded pages of school paper from inside his cut soft, already from handling, and he found the place. And in the high, clean wind off the water, he read his dead president's words about the woman he had loved in silence for 50 years. The plain, clumsy, beautiful words of a man who could fix any engine ever made, but had never once in his life been able to fix the simple, broken thing in himself that kept him from saying out loud what he felt. And the words said that every good thing the club had ever been, every mile of brotherhood, and every engine that ever sang under them, traced back through him to a pair of hands in a desert shop that the world had never let be famous, and that his one regret, the single regret of a long and mostly unregretful life, was that he had honored her wish to stay hidden so faithfully that he had let her grow old, unseen, and that he was trusting them now, his brothers, to undo in one morning what he had spent 50 years carefully and lovingly building, which was the silence around her and to make her name ring. And Duke read it through to the end this time, without breaking, because the wind held him up the way it had always held up men who came to that bluff to feel small. And when he was done, he folded the pages and put them away, and the brothers stood a moment longer, and then they put their hats back on, one by one, and they walked back to their machines, and they fired them up, and the thunder of 71 engines rolled out over the bluff and down the highway, carrying nothing now but the living, carrying them home to do the one thing their founder had asked of them with his dying pen. They came back down out of the high country in the long gold light of late afternoon. Word had gone ahead of them somehow, the way word does in small towns, traveling faster than any engine on phone lines and across fences and over the counters of feed stores, so that by the time the first thunder of the column rolled down off the grade and into the basin, the whole of Dry Fork had come out into its one square to see. They lined the wooden sidewalks 3 deep. They stood in the bed of pickup trucks. The diner had emptied, and the feed store had emptied, and the hardware man had locked his door and come to stand with the rest, and the children sat up on their father's shoulders, and every soul in that town had turned out without quite knowing why, only that the 70 outlaws who had carried a dead man out at dawn were coming back at dusk, and that something was owed to be witnessed. Della Vaughn stood where she had stood that morning, in the center of the square by the courthouse steps, with Maisie's hand in hers. She had not gone home. She had sat the long day out in the diner and on the bench in the square, and she had told the girls stories about a young woman with grease to her elbows and a husband named Wade who could not weld a straight bead to save his life, but who looked at her like she had hung the moon. And she had watched the light go long and gold across the old stone buildings. And she had waited because some part of her that she did not fully understand needed to see the bike come back empty with her own eyes to know it was truly finished. The column rolled in slow and filled the square the way water fills a basin, engine after engine after engine, until the cobblestones disappeared under a sea of chrome and black leather, and the thunder of it stood up off the stone and pressed against the buildings, and the revelator came at the head of it, riderless, behind in its purpose. Now the sissy bar bare where the urn had ridden out, and Duke Steele brought it to a stop, dead center in the square, 10 feet from the old woman, and killed the engine. The silence came down hard. And then Duke Steele did a thing that no one in that town would ever forget, and that the brothers behind him would tell for the rest of their days. He got down off the revelator. He took his hat off, and the old enforcer, the man who had put fear into 4 states for 36 years, walked the 10 feet across the cobblestones to the small old woman in the chambray shirt, and in front of his whole club and the whole of Dry Fork, he got down. Not to a knee, all the way down both knees, on the hard stone, the way a man kneels, who has decided that his pride is a small price, and gladly paid. And behind him, without a word spoken, without a signal given, 70 outlaws came down off their idling machines, and took off their hats, and knelt down on the cobblestones of that square, in the gold evening light. 70 of them, a sea of bowed gray heads, and bare necks, and weathered hands, kneeling to a 74-year-old woman who fixed tractors. And the people of Dry Fork made a sound, a low, collective intake of breath, and more than one of them began quietly to cry without understanding the half of it. "Ma'am," Duke Steele said from his knees, and his voice carried clean across the silent square. "We put him in the wind. He went easy off the high bluff the way he asked. And before he went, every man here learned your name and what you are, and we are not ever going to forget it again." He reached into his cut slow and drew out something small that caught the gold light. "Preacher gave you a name once that wasn't yours to keep you safe, and you carried it 50 years. We'd like to give you one that is yours if you'll have it. The Desert Saints have never in our history put a patch on a soul who didn't earn it on the road. We've never made an exception, and we never will." He held it up. It was a small one cut down and stitched for a small frame black leather, and across the back of it, in the club's own rockers, it did not say a road name, and it did not say a lie. It said in plain thread, "The Dove," and under it, first of the name, "Founding Hand." But the bylaws Preacher wrote with his own pen 40 years ago have got a line in them most of us never read, that says the founder may name one honorary member for life for service to the club beyond the reach of any patch, and the founder named you. Last night, in writing, the ink's barely dry. He held the cutout across the cobblestones in both hands. "You built our sound, ma'am. You kept our founder alive and running for 50 years. You are more a saint than half the men kneeling behind me, and they all just agreed to it, every one of them, out loud on that bluff. So this is yours, Della Vaughn, the Dove, if you'll take it." The old woman looked at the cut. She had spent 50 years being unseen. She had built a legend and watched another name grow famous on it, and made her peace with the dark a long time ago. Told herself it did not matter. Told herself the work was the thing and not the name on it, and she had nearly come to believe it. And now here was an outlaw on his knees in the public square, holding up the one thing she had told herself for half a century that she did not want. And she discovered, standing there with her granddaughter's hand in hers, and the whole town watching, that she had wanted it the entire time, wanted only to be seen once, plainly, by the people who rode the engines her hands had made, and that the wanting had been so deep and so long buried that the sudden answering of it nearly took her legs out from under her. She let go of Maisie's hand. She stepped forward, and she took the cut out of Duke Steele's two hands. "I'll take it," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "On one condition, Mr. Steele, and it isn't for me." She turned the small cut over in her old hands and looked at her name stitched plain across the back of it, the truth of her finally written somewhere. A person could read it. Preacher's letters said make them carve it somewhere, it would last. I don't need it carved. I've got it now, right here in my hands, and that's enough for an old woman. She lifted her head, and her eyes found the girl standing wide-eyed at the edge of the kneeling men. "But that child there is Maisie. She's mine. Her mother was mine, and the good Lord took her, and the girl came to live with me. And last night when grown men with 40 years on the wrench couldn't find the wire, that snake tore loose inside that engine. It was her hand, small enough to reach where none of yours could fit, that put it back together so the Revelator could run into this square this morning and save my land. So you want to carve something." Her voice rose and rang off the old stone. "You carve hers. You carve that a 9-year-old girl's hand brought the Revelator back to life on the morning the dove took her land back. You teach her what I know before I'm gone, every one of you that can hold a wrench, so it doesn't die with me in the dark the way it almost did. That's my condition. The name you carve is hers, not mine." And Duke Steele, still on his knees, looked over at the small girl and then back up at the old woman, and a slow, broken smile came up under the gray of his beard, and he said, "We'll carve them both, ma'am, side by side. There's room on that clubhouse wall for two." They raised her up onto the Revelator. Then the brothers did lifted her light as nothing, up into the saddle of the machine she had built, and they set the small cut across her shoulders, and they put Maisie up in front of her, where the old woman could keep one arm sure around the child, and Duke Steele took the bars and walked the great bike slow around the square, once on foot leading it, so that the whole of Dry Fork could see the dove sitting her own legend at last, with her granddaughter held safe against her, and the people of that town, who still did not understand the half of it, stood and clapped and wept and hollered the way people do when they are in the presence of something true and have the sense for once to honor it. And the sound of 70 idling engines and a whole town's voices rose up off the cobblestones into the gold and dying light. They rode her home after slow the whole column out the 40 miles to the little place on the 40 acres, with the shop out back and the cottonwood and the single weathered headstone under it, where Wade Vaughn had lain since 1978. They shut the engines off in her yard, and the desert quiet came down, and the stars came out the way they only do that far from any town, hard and bright and numberless. And the brothers did not roar off into the night. They stayed. They built a fire in the old ring by the shop. Somebody had brought food, and somebody else produced more, and they fed the old woman and the girl. And they sat up half the night in her yard telling stories about Silas Boone, the real ones now, and the tall ones too. And every so often one of the old hands would drift over to the shop and put his head in the open bay, where the work lights still hung, and look at the tools hung in their painted outlines on the pegboard, each one in its place. 50 years of a master's order, and shake his head slow at what had been hidden out here in the dark the whole time. 40 miles from the clubhouse, fixing their tractors. Late, when the fire had burned down to a low, red bed of coals, and most of the brothers had gone quiet, drowsing in their chairs, or stretched out on bedrolls under the cottonwood, Maisie fell asleep in the old woman's lap, with the small black cut still draped over her grandmother's shoulders. And Duke Steele came and lowered himself onto an upturned crate beside them, with a grunt that spoke of every one of his 60-odd years. For a while, neither of them said anything. The coals ticked and settled. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, and another answered it far off. And the great river of stars wheeled slow overhead, the way it had wheeled over that desert long before any of them were born, and would go on wheeling long after the last of them was dust. "He used to talk about you," Duke said finally, very low, so as not to wake the child. "I know that now. Years back, drunk one night, he got to going on about a woman who could hear an engine the way other folks hear music. Said she was the best who ever lived, and the world would never know it. I thought it was the whiskey talking. I thought he meant some gal from his young days, somebody long gone." He shook his big head slow at the coals. "He meant you. He was talking about you the whole time, and I poured him another and laughed and told him to go to bed. 50 years he carried it, and the one time it slipped out of him, I didn't have the sense to listen." Della looked down at the sleeping girl, at the small chest rising and falling, and she was quiet a moment. "He was a good man who did a hard thing for a long time," she said. "That's all any of us are in the end, if we're lucky. Somebody who did the hard thing as long as they could." She tucked the cut closer around the child. "You listened tonight, Mr. Steele. You listened when it counted. That's worth more than all the times you didn't, and you can let the rest of it go. He'd want you to. Lord knows he held on to enough for the both of you." And Duke Steele, the most feared man in 4 states, sat by a dying fire in an old woman's yard and felt something he had been carrying for years quietly set itself down. And he did not say another word because none was needed. And the two of them watched the coals go to ash, with the sleeping girl between them, and the dead man's bike gleaming dark in the open bay behind. Brock Riggs was gone. He did not come back to Dry Fork. The land deal collapsed with the foreclosure canceled, and his money tangled in the lies he had told to get it. And the last anyone heard, he had left the state ahead of his own creditors, and the Desert Saints, who knew now exactly what he was, and exactly what he had nearly cost them, made it quietly understood in the places such things are understood, that Brock Riggs no longer existed to them, which for a man like Brock Riggs was a worse sentence than any other they could have handed down. He had wanted the Dub's secret to make himself rich. In the end, the secret got out without him freely given into the wind, off a bluff and onto a clubhouse wall. And there was no profit in it for anybody, which was the only proper end for a thing that had only ever been about love. The name went up on the clubhouse wall that next month, carved deep into a slab of desert stone, set into the brick by the door where every brother passed it coming and going. It said, Della Vaughn, the Dove, founding hand. And under it, exactly as she had demanded, in the same deep-cut letters, the same size, no smaller, Maisie Vaughn, who brought the Revelator home. And on Sundays through that long desert summer, and the autumn after it, riders would come out the 40 miles to the little shop, 2 and 3 at a time, and the old woman would stand them at her bench with the girl beside her, and she would put a wrench in a calloused outlaw hand, and a smaller one in the child's, and she would teach them slow and exact, and without an ounce of mercy for sloppy work, the things she knew, so that what was in her head and her hands would not go into the ground with her the way it so nearly had. The way the magic of every quiet master goes into the ground unrecorded when the world cannot be bothered to learn their name in time. The mailbox out at the end of the long dirt drive said, Vaughn. It had said Vaughn for 50 years, and now it would go on saying it free and clear, the deed reinstated, and the sale canceled, and the snake's lawyers gone. The 40 acres safe, Wade safe under his cottonwood, the girl safe in the house, the old woman safe in her own bed, where she had told the banker she intended to die, a great many years from now, an old woman with her name on her own mailbox. And some evenings when the work was done, and the light went long and gold across the sage, the way it had on the day they brought her home, in her own colors, Della Vaughn would walk out back to the shop and stand a while, with her hand on the cool black tank of the Revelator, which lived in her bay now, which Duke Steele had insisted on the founder's own bike, kept by the founding hand that made it. And she would think about a young woman with grease to her elbows in a different desert a long time ago, and a husband who could not weld, but looked at her like she hung the moon, and a clumsy, paranoid genius of a man who loved her the only broken way he knew how, and kept her secret 50 years, and gave her in the end, from beyond the grave, the only thing she had ever truly wanted, which was to be seen. And she would fire the great engine up just for a minute, just to hear it, the heavy, uneven thunder of her own young hands, rolling out across 40 acres of darkening desert and up against the stars, and somewhere in the sound of it, if she listened the way only she could listen, she could hear all of them still. Every soul she had ever loved and lost, running true and running strong, kept alive a little longer than they had any right to be by the dove.